You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello friends and welcome to Proof Text or Glossa House TV. I'm Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, and in this episode, which is a Fallacy of the Week episode, I want to offer a response to an atheist. Now, if you watch the podcast or Glossa House TV at all, you'll know that last week I had the opportunity to have on world-renowned Bible scholar Dr. Craig Keener. And if you weren't able to watch or listen to that episode on Spotify or watch it on Glossa House TV on the YouTube channel, you should go check it out. So it's episode number 1074, titled Jesus, Atheism, and Ancient History, a conversation with Dr. Craig Keener. Now, what's interesting to me, other than the conversation itself, is a comment that appeared on YouTube. It's from a person whose handle is Atheist, and he says this, and I want to spend some time replying to this in this episode, just offering a Christian response. So he says, I'm an atheist. I define atheism as suspending any acknowledgement as to the reality of any particular God until sufficient credible evidence is introduced. My position is that I have no good reason to acknowledge the reality of any God. And here's why I currently hold to such a position. Below are 10 facts I must consider when evaluating the claim made by certain theists that some God exists in reality. To be clear, these are not premises for any argument concluding there to be no gods. These are simply facts I must take into account when evaluating such a claim. All right, so that sounds pretty good. The rhetoric's pretty good. But I want to offer a few responses to this. And since this is a Fallacy of the Week episode, that's sort of the angle I'm going to take. I'm going to poke holes in these statements and show you where and how they are fallacious. Okay, so let's look at this beginning. It says, I define atheism, and that should tip us off right there. That's fine. I think it's good to define your terms. But whenever someone says, I define, rather than the definition of atheism is, that should tip you off, right? Because they're the one now getting to control the definitions, and that can be a huge problem. Because we may have very different definitions, or they may use a non-sort of standard definition, and so on. So that should tip us off right there. The fallacy of ambiguity, perhaps. But it says, I define atheism as suspending any acknowledgement as to the reality of any particular God until sufficient credible evidence is introduced. He says, my position is that I have no good reason to acknowledge the reality of any God. Okay, so I would say that we probably have a straw man fallacy going on here in a way. And this fallacy occurs when an argument misrepresents an opponent's position to make it easier to attack. And so, for example, I could say, atheists just hate religion, and that's why they want to destroy it. And that would be a straw man. Why did I say this might be a straw man? It could also be a definitional fallacy or an ambiguity fallacy, is because the definition offered is oversimplifying atheism, in my view. And in doing that, it's also misrepresenting the positions of many other atheists. So many other atheists aren't going to necessarily have the same definition and make this argument. So it's misrepresenting the position of atheism in general. And many other atheists who actively engage in philosophical discussions about the nature of belief and evidence. And so we have to remember that atheism can involve a range of beliefs. It can include positive disbelief in gods and not merely a suspension of acknowledgement, as is happening here. Okay, so in the opening remarks, we already see some fallacious reasoning going on, and this is framing everything. And so a fallacy is what's going to frame the sort of 10 arguments that this person's going to offer. All right, and then the person also has closing remarks, and there's a bunch of fallacies in there too, and we'll get to that in due course. But now I want to go through the the 10 points that this person offers. And I'll just say right out of the gate that this overall structure of the argument hinges on personal experiences and observation. So it's largely anecdotal. And, while anecdotal stuff can be compelling on a subjective level, it can also lead to a bunch of fallacies. And that's what it does here. So, for example, we notice that number one says, I personally have never observed a God. All right, so this is an argument from personal incredulity or personal experience. And this kind of fallacy occurs when somebody concludes that something is false because they personally find it difficult to understand or believe. Like, personally, I just find that incredulous. I can't find that believable. I can't believe that somebody experienced that, right? And so it's the fallacy of personal incredulity. And right, I could say something like, I can't imagine how the human brain could have evolved naturally. So it must have been designed by a higher power. And you could argue, like, from a sort of a theistic standpoint and do the same sort of thing, right? Because you're saying, I can't imagine how that could happen. That's the operating sort of language there. That's what creates this fallacy. I can't imagine how this could have happened, or how this could be, or how this could be the case. And so it's this personal incredulity, right? This fallacy. And so a sort of counter response to this is the fact that Theos Skeptoman, this person, hasn't observed a God personally, doesn't provide evidence about the existence or non-existence of God or a God. Right? Many phenomena exist that individuals have not yet personally observed, but they're widely accepted and based on evidence and the observations of others. So just because he hasn't experienced it, doesn't or observed it, doesn't mean that no one else has, and that is true. So this appeal to personal incredulity is a fallacy. It's a fallacy. The second statement here is, I've never encountered any person who has claimed to have observed a God. Okay, so I would say this is a fallacy that's called an argument from ignorance. Okay, so this fallacy is asserting that a proposition is true because it hasn't yet been proven false, or vice versa, right? And so you could say, no one has proven that aliens do not exist, so they got to be real. Well, the lack of personal encounters with people who claim to have observed a God, like this person's lack of personal encounters with people who claim to have observed a God, doesn't serve as evidence against the existence of a God. Right? Absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Right? And so that's a very important point. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Okay, so right here in these first two, we have the fallacy, this argument from personal incredulity, and then a fallacy, the argument from ignorance. And in both cases, we're not actually given evidence. It's just like personal stuff. All right, the third thing, and by the way, you can point this out by noting that pretty much all the statements begin with I. It was very individualistic. And very personal, right? So the third one is, I know of no accounts of persons claiming to have observed a God that were willing or able to demonstrate or verify their observation for authenticity, accuracy, or validity. Now, this is a hasty generalization fallacy, and that occurs when a conclusion is drawn from a sample that's too small or not representative, and then it's applied across the board to everyone. So I can say, like, my friend from this person I went to college with from New York is rude. Therefore, all New Yorkers are rude. Right? So that could be true that they're all rude, but I can't base that on one person. It's a hasty generalization to base that on one person and apply it to everybody. And so the reality is, just because this person hasn't come across verifiable accounts doesn't mean they don't exist. Right? Verification of such experiences can be really complex. They may not be easily accessible or demonstrable, using current methods and so on and so forth, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. So that's an important point to get there. So we have 3 fallacies on the first 3 points already. Each point's fallacious. Number 4, also going to be fallacious. It says, that should be your tip off there, I've never been presented a valid logical argument which also employed sound premises that lead deductively to a conclusion that a god or gods exist in reality. Okay, so this again is the appeal to, I would say this is an appeal to ignorance. And so it's a fallacy of an appeal to ignorance. This kind of fallacy asserts that a proposition is false because it hasn't been proven true. Listen to that again. This fallacy is arguing that a proposition premise is false because it hasn't been proven true, right? So you could be like, look, nobody has proven that ghosts exist, so they must not be real. Nobody has proven that demons or angels exist, so they must not be real. Well, the truth is that a lack of exposure to a valid argument in your experience doesn't mean such arguments don't exist or that such proofs aren't real, right? The philosophical landscape, if we look across the breadth of it, is really rich with debates and arguments both for and against the existence of God or gods. Right? And this has been conversation for a long time. So this is a fallacy too. Number 5 says, of the many logical syllogisms I've encountered arguing for the reality of a god or gods, I have found all to contain either logical fallacies or false or unsubstantiated premises. Again, this you could maybe say this is a hasty generalization, probably better to call it an overgeneralization. And that occurs, like the hasty generalization, when a conclusion is drawn about a small sampling of something, and you take what the characteristic based on that small sampling, and then you apply it across the board. All politicians are corrupt because I know a few who are. All New Yorkers are rude because I know one who is. Right? While some arguments may be flawed, that's true, this doesn't invalidate all possible arguments for the existence of God. That's important. Let me say that. So while some arguments may indeed be flawed, that doesn't invalidate all possible arguments for the existence of God. Right? So each argument has to be evaluated on its own terms. All right. So number 6, he goes on and says, I've never observed a phenomenon in which the existence of a god was a necessary antecedent for the known or probable explanation for the causation of that phenomenon. Okay, this is a bit wordy, but this gets into that issue as Dr. Keenan was talking about in the video, where he says he's talking about the first cause, essentially, and then the infinite regress or infinite regression is it often called. If there is no first cause, then it just keeps going. You never find first cause, and so there is good philosophical and theological arguments for the idea that God is the first cause. But anyways, I think the fallacy here really is begging the question, and a begging the question of fallacy occurs when an argument's premises assume the truth of the conclusion instead of supporting it. All right. So it can be like, reading is important because it's necessary to read. Well, that's where it's going in circles now. Begging questions, circular reasoning, same thing. Right. So the assertion assumes that all phenomena must have explanations that exclude the divine by default. So how can we ever talk about God then? It's circular reasoning because it doesn't consider the possibility that a divine explanation might be the best explanation in some cases, or the only explanation in some cases. So it just rules that out. So that's a fallacy, circular reasoning fallacy, begging the question. All right, 7, he says, several proposed and generally accepted explanations for observable phenomena that were previously based on the agency of a god or gods have subsequently been replaced with rational natural explanations, each substantiated with evidence that excluded the agency of a god or gods. I've never encountered vice versa. This is a false dichotomy fallacy, friends. And a false dichotomy fallacy occurs when only 2 options are presented when more exist. So you're either with us or against us. I often use that one on the podcast. So the transition from supernatural to natural explanations doesn't necessarily negate the existence of gods. Okay? It merely shows that our understanding of the natural world has increased and developed, become more complex. It's possible that both natural processes and divine intervention could coexist. That's a third option. It's a real option. It might be the best option. All right. So number 8, he says, I've never experienced the presence of a God through intercession of angels, divine revelation, the miraculous act of divinity, or any occurrence of a supernatural event. Again, this is the fallacy of personal incredulity. And as I said above, this happens when when someone believes something to be false simply because it's difficult to understand or believe, and they've never experienced it or believed it. Right? I could again say, like, I can't understand how the universe could have come from nothing, so it must have been created by God, if you wanted to try to do the same thing from a Christian standpoint. And I did that earlier from a Christian standpoint, just trying to be fair, right? I couldn't understand, right? I can't imagine. Like, it doesn't make sense to me how. These kind of phrases are perfect tip-offs to the fallacy of personal incredulity. So we got to remember, personal experience is subjective and not universally true or applicable. The lack of personal experience doesn't constitute evidence against the existence of God. It just doesn't. It's a personal opinion. Number 9, he says, every phenomenon that I have observed has emerged from necessary and sufficient antecedents over time without exception. So he's saying he doesn't believe in first cause here. In other words, I've never observed a phenomenon, entity, process, object, event, process, again, substance, system, or being that was created ex nihilo. That is, instantaneously came into existence by the solitary volition of a deity. All right. And you have to see here, there's a hasty generalization fallacy going. So it's just like the same fallacies over and over and over, just in different forms, different words, right? The hasty generalization fallacy, as I've said, occurs when a conclusion drawn from a sample that's small and not really representative, but then applied across the board, right? All swans are white because every swan I've seen is white. All New Yorkers are rude because I knew a rude one, right? The fact that all observed phenomena have antecedents doesn't preclude the possibility of divine creation. It doesn't. This is an assumption based on a limited set of observations. Period. All right. So finally, he gets down to number 10, and or she, I don't know, gets down to number 10 and says, all claims of a supernatural or divine nature that I have encountered have either been refuted to my satisfaction or do not present as falsifiable. Okay. This is the fallacy of subjective validation, and this goes right hand in hand with what's been going on here the whole time. This personal incredulity, all this sort of personal anecdote and these sorts of things. The subjective validation fallacy occurs when something's considered true based on personal experience or belief. Okay, I guess I could say I believe in astrology because my horoscope's always accurate. Well, personal satisfaction with refutations doesn't equate to objective truth, yeah? The lack of falsifiability doesn't necessarily mean a claim is false. It may simply be beyond the current scope of scientific inquiry. Yeah. All right, let's get down to... So let me reiterate these 10. I'll just say on these. The arguments that are presented here, they rely heavily on personal subjective experience and personal observation, personal anecdotes, and this all leads to a bunch of logical fallacies. A more robust approach would involve considering a wider range of evidence and a wider range of arguments, both for and against perhaps the existence of God or gods, while at the same time avoiding reliance on this subjective experience and these many overgeneralizations and hasty generalizations as well. So let's look at the closing remarks here, because I think these are important too. In the closing remarks, He says, all of these facts, well, no, they're not facts, they're fallacies. I just showed that. He says, all of these facts lead me to the only rational conclusion, false dichotomy, that concurs, and also like shutting the conversation down, that concurs with the realities I have been presented, personal, subjective, incredulity, and that is the fact, it's a fallacy, that there is no good reason for me to acknowledge the reality of any God. False. This is the appeal to personal experience again. This occurs when personal experiences are used as the primary basis, the litmus test for an argument. I've never seen a ghost, so a ghost must not exist, right? Well, while personal experiences are valid for forming individual beliefs, they're not sufficient to make a universal claim about the existence or non-existence of God or gods, right? Objective evidence and broader conditions and considerations and evidences and proofs are necessary. There's also a false dichotomy fallacy, as I pointed out, when only two options are presented, when there's probably more, right? Do you believe in science or you believe in religion? Well, here, right, this conclusion is presenting a false dichotomy by implying that the only rational position is disbelief in gods based on personal experiences. There are many rational theists who find compelling reasons to believe in God or gods, right? And many philosophical arguments that explore that range of beliefs. He continues, said, I've often heard that atheism is the denial of the Abrahamic God. But denial is the active rejection of a substantiated fact once credible evidence has been presented. Atheism is simply withholding such acknowledgement until sufficient credible evidence is introduced. It's natural, rational, and prudent to be skeptical of unsubstantiated claims, especially extraordinary ones. This is the fallacy of equivocation or ambiguity. And that occurs when a word is used in two different senses in an argument, right? So I've used the example on the podcast before. The sign said, fine for parking here. So I parked because it was fine. Well, the definition of atheism, withholding acknowledgement, at least as it's said here, is one interpretation or one definition, but it can also mean a positive disbelief in gods. And some people would define it that way. So this statement is also using denial and withholding acknowledgement interchangeably, which confuse the argument as well. And so wordiness actually doesn't help here. It creates equivocation and ambiguity and helps this lapse into a fallacy or reveals the fallaciousness here. There's an appeal to skepticism as well going on, and that occurs when skepticism is presented as inherently superior without considering the context of evidence. We've been given no evidence by this person, just personal anecdotal statements, right? And so skepticism, while it can be healthy and important, it's got to be applied consistently and not selectively. Being skeptical of religious claims while accepting other extraordinary claims without scrutiny, for example, would be inconsistent. Rational skepticism involves a balanced evaluation of all evidence, and that's not happening here. It's all personal. It's all personal. So this person doesn't engage any theists, for example. We have the straw man, we have the appeal to personal experience, false dichotomy, equivocation or ambiguity, we have the appeal to skepticism, and so on and so forth. There are at least 20 fallacies, maybe a couple dozen in this one post. And that's because what we have is a lot of no evidence, no proof, a lot of personal experience, a lot of subjective experience, a lot of misrepresentations, generalizations. And so again, a better approach would be to involve an actual balanced evaluation of evidence and arguments, consistent application of skepticism, and a fair representation of different beliefs. And so that's why I think this post is problematic. And by the way, the post gets reduplicated for some reason in the comments, but yep, so that's why I'm not buying it, and that's why I'm not subscribing, and I still think theism, particularly from within a Christian framework, is the best option for making sense of reality and for making sense of life. And explaining what's going on and what's happening in our world and making sense of it all. So, all right, friends, that's a Christian response to an atheist. I'm going to stop there and say I hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.